Hey everybody, I'm really glad you found Suncrest Messages. I do hope you'll take a minute to subscribe to either our podcast or our YouTube channel. And you can also download the Suncrest app. There's great stuff there that goes far beyond these messages. Either way, I hope that the next 30 minutes helps you integrate faith with your life. Enjoy.
Hey Suncrest, my name is Pizzichillo and I'm a church planter all the way over on Long Island, which is about 850 miles away from you, or 12 and a half hours if you decide to drive, depending on how fast you drive. And I know that because I just asked Google, and she knows everything. I had a chance to check in with you several months ago, and I said this to you then, but I have to say it to you again. I am so grateful for the way that you've supported us as a church. In case you don't know this, we just started in January, and we are able to do what we're doing here because of what you're doing over there. So on behalf of myself, my family, and this church community, I wanted to say thank you. Thank you for your generosity, for having vision beyond the walls of Suncrest. We are seeing lives changed here. It's a beautiful thing, and it's been made possible because of people like you. So thank you. Today, I want to talk to you about a problem. It's an issue. We might even say it's a toxin, meaning it poisons. Poisons the way that we see ourselves, poisons the way that we understand God, the way that we live our lives. It poisons our emotional health, our spiritual health. But it's an issue that I love to talk about because it is so rarely spoken about. And the cool thing about it is that it really affects everybody in every stage of life, no matter where you are on the faith spectrum, whether you consider yourself a church person or not. Maybe someone's tied you up or twisted your arm or is forcing you to watch this. No matter where you are, this is something that all of us deal with to some extent or another. But when we take the time to address it, it is so incredibly rewarding. And I'm not going to tell you what that toxin is yet. I'm going to kind of leave you in suspense a little bit. But we're going to look at a story. And the story is the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Now, before we jump into this, if you've heard of the story, most people have heard of the story. If you have, I know that there are some people that have a difficult time kind of wrapping their minds around this story. I mean, it's a story of two naked people in paradise that are deceived by a talking animal. And that doesn't happen every day. So if you struggle to believe that, that's certainly understandable. But here are two things. First thing I'd say is to continue to ask questions, to continue to struggle through it. Because I think what you'll see is that there's some really good stuff written about this story. And if you continue, I think you'll start to find some answers that will satisfy you. But at the same time, I would also ask you for today, just for today, to take your hangups, your doubts, your reservations, your difficulty believing this, and just set it aside. Just pretend with me. And I think what you'll see is that there are some really profound principles in this story that have the ability to affect our lives today here in 2020. And so this story. It's a story of God making everything. After everything he makes, he says that it's good. And when he's done with everything, he steps back, he looks at everything and he says, it is very good. It's really good. The idea is that he's celebrating. And it's this picture of paradise. It's a picture of everything the way that it's supposed to be. And part of that picture in paradise are two people, Adam and Eve, the first two people. And they're living in paradise. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm a questions guy. I got lots of questions. I was always the kid that was raising his hand. Even when I go out with my friends who go to a restaurant, I got questions about everything on the menu. I just like to be well informed. And so right away, I want to know, what is it like to live in paradise? Maybe you know the show The Office, right? Where there's a scene, and then after the scene, they cut away and they have these little private interviews. And the people in the show will talk about the scene that just happened. They'll be like, oh, I can't believe you did that, or I can't believe that happened, or whatever. They kind of reflect and they give you a different viewpoint on the issue that happened. I would love to have a scene like that in the whole story of Adam and Eve. Like, cut away. Just tell me, what's it like? Like, what time do you wake up in the morning? What do you eat for breakfast? Do you ever fight with your wife? Do you play games? Do you win? Do you lose? If you lose, is that like an infraction on the rules of paradise? What is it like to live in paradise? Is every food tastes good? Do you get tired when you go for a jog? What's it like, right? Well, fortunately, we do get a little summary statement of what it's like to be people in paradise, how they were and what they felt. And here it is. You ready? Here it is. It says, Adam the man, and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. Now, if you're familiar with this story, if you've heard this before, you've probably heard this 1,000 times. And as soon as I start reading, they're like, yeah, I know, next, like what goes on? It does not register emotionally with us because some of us have heard it so many times. But if you haven't heard it for the first time, you're probably thinking, what an awkward thing to share. Like, why is that the one thing that they tell us about paradise, that they weren't wearing clothes and they didn't care that they weren't wearing clothes? What's the point of that? So I grew up playing a lot of sports. I spent a lot of time in locker rooms, and even now, not now, but back when people went to gyms, I would spend a lot of time in the locker room at the gym. And so I've seen a lot of the whole naked and unashamed thing. And for me, it's not my picture of paradise. And so it makes me wonder, what is going on here? Why is that the one thing that we find out about with these people? And here's the idea. Those two people, they are completely exposed, and yet they are completely embraced. We could say that they are fully known and they are fully loved, not just physically, but they're fully seen for who they are and fully accepted. And I would argue that that's what we crave now, here, today. That's how we were made to live. I mean, think about it. Your best relationships are probably the ones that most closely resemble this picture. Now, obviously not the whole not wearing clothes thing, but this idea of you see me, you know me for the good, for the bad, for the success, for the failures, my good moods, my bad moods, all of that. You love me anyway. The strongest marriages typically are marriages that are the closest to this. Like, yeah, he knows my quirks, he knows my moods, he knows or she knows, right? And she knows me, she gets me, and she loves me. Fully known and fully loved. We crave this. And what do we say? Like with our friends, when we have strong relationships are like this, we say, I can be myself when I'm with them. I can be fully seen because I am fully loved. We crave this. And that is the picture that, like Adam and Eve, they are this to the fullest extent. That is the picture of relational paradise. But if you know the story, you probably know that it doesn't stay that way. There's this serpent, and they start talking to the serpent. And the serpent convinces them that God is holding out on them, right? That there's a better way to go, and God doesn't want them to have any part of it. And so what do? They're deceived, and they break the one rule they weren't supposed to break. There's only one thing they were told not to do. Don't eat from this one tree. And they do. And according to the rest of Scripture, the rest of the Bible, that was the moment when sin, when death, when brokenness, when pain entered the world. That was the moment where perfection went to brokenness. And so I don't know if you're like me, like maybe you know the story, and it's hard to not know, to remember what it's like to not know something if you know it. But just think about this, like what would you expect to happen? If I made this story up and I'm writing it, I'd be like, okay, well, they ate. And you know what happened? Well, Eve turned green, and then they broke out in this major fight. And there are babies crying, and there's fire raining down from the sky because this is the moment pain enters the world. And, they're yelling at each other. And then Adam takes one of his ribs and he rips it out. And he's like, I'm going to go find another woman, right? And it's just this picture of absolute horror. But that's not exactly what we get. We get another little statement that explains their reaction. And here's what it is. This is in Genesis chapter 3, verse 7. It says, then the eyes of both of them were opened right after they ate. They realized they were naked, so they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. They go from fully known and fully loved to being painfully aware of their failures, pulling back, covering up, and being afraid of what's going to happen if you see the real me. So for the first time, we're introduced to this concept called shame. Shame. That's the topic that we're talking about today. That's the toxin that we're talking about today. And it has plagued the human race ever since that moment. There's a author, researcher, her name's Brene Brown. She's gotten really popular lately. She's on Netflix now, so now you know she made it. But she wrote a book called Daring Greatly. I highly recommend it. It's not a faith-based book, but it might as well be because it hits these principles right on the head. She talks about shame. She talks about how shame is an attack on the identity, how we understand ourselves. And here's her definition of shame. She says, shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and acceptance or belonging. Shame is an attack on the identity. It's this unquenching feeling of never enough, right? I'm never smart enough, never tall enough, never good enough, never strong enough, never pretty enough, never thin enough, never enough, never enough, never enough, or not good enough. I'm not a good enough person, not a good enough Christian, not a good enough husband, not a good enough father, not a good enough mother, not a good enough wife, not a good enough employee, not a good enough business person, not a good enough boss, not a good enough pastor, not a good enough salesman. No matter what, it's this standard that can never be reached. It's an attack on the identity. It's this feeling of being like unworthy of being accepted. It's this feeling of failure that brings along with it this feeling that we don't deserve to be loved. We don't deserve to have a place to belong. We are never, ever, ever enough. Shame is universal. It affects everybody. It can apply to any area of life. And what's also universal is that most people don't want to talk about it. Why? Because that too can be shameful, especially for men. A lot of men don't like to talk about the fact that they don't feel like they're enough, that they're working super long hours to try to prove that they are worth something. It's a difficult thing to talk about. Brene Brown, she got together with some of her clients and she asked them, like, hey, can you just give me an example of what shame is for you? And here are some of the responses. They said, shame is getting laid off and having to tell my pregnant wife. Shame is having someone ask, when are you due? And I'm not pregnant. It's hiding the fact that I'm in recovery. It's bankruptcy. It's raging at my kids. It's my boss calling me an idiot. It's not making partner. It's my husband leaving me for the girl next door. It's dealing with the consequences of my affair. It's getting cut from the team. It's my DUI. It's infertility. It's internet porn. It's flunking out of school. It's this endless, unquenchable feeling of not being enough. There was a time when people believed that shame was a good thing. And even some people now believe that shame is a good thing. Like you've heard people say, I'm sure, shame on you. You should be ashamed of yourself. But researchers have found that shame is highly correlated with addiction, with violence, with depression, aggression, bullying, and eating disorders. In fact, listen to this, researchers don't find shame correlated with positive outcomes at all. There is no data to support that shame is a helpful compass for good behavior. It just doesn't work. It speaks to the identity and it corrodes the belief that we can do better. I mentioned there are some places that are okay with shame. And some of those places are churches. And I'm sure that there are people that are listening to this that came from church or religious backgrounds where shame was not only accepted, but shame was leveraged, shame was used as a motivator. And I'm telling you, we believe that Jesus came to take away your shame, not to add to it. So I don't know, maybe if you're like me, you might think like, well, okay, well, that sounds nice, but does that mean we have no standard? Like, I mean, some of the things that I listed are pretty rough things. Like, you know, like, should we DUI? Like, is it okay to drive drunk? Should we continue to rage at our kids like this and having an affair? All those things are those things we should just say, well, yeah, well, whatever, who cares, right? And I think that's where we need to make a clear distinction between shame and guilt. Most of us, when we use the word guilt, what we actually mean is shame. And there's a huge difference that we cannot miss. Shame is tied to an identity, to how I understand myself, whereas guilt is unmistakably tied to an action, to something that happened. Shame says, I am bad, right? I am someone bad, whereas guilt says, I did something bad. There is a huge, huge difference between the two, and the implications are huge, huge. Shame is very emotional. Whereas guilt is much more of a condition than it is emotion. Guilt is something that's judicial, whereas shame is relational. One has to do with an identity. The other one has to do with an action. Think about it like this. So not too long ago, I came home from work one day and I was in a bad mood and I was telling my wife like how horrible my life is. It's really not that bad, but I was complaining that day and it was past my daughter's bedtime. She's 5 years old and she comes out and she's like, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." And I'm like, "Mia, be quiet." Her name is Mia. I was like, "Mia, wait, wait." She's like, "But Daddy, Daddy." She keeps going. I'm like, "Wait, wait." Then finally, like 2, 3, 4 more times, finally I trying to look at her. I was like, "Mia, go back upstairs to your room. It's past your bedtime. You shouldn't be out here anyway." And I was just totally rude to her. Now, listen, I'm all for discipline. This was not a calculated parental step of discipline. This was me losing my temper and just not being nice. And so a little while later, my wife goes up to check on the kids and she sees my daughter crying in her bed. And she said, "What's wrong, Mia?" And this is a 5-year-old. She said, "I've been waiting all day for Daddy to come home. And when he finally did, he yelled at me and he told me to go away." And my wife came out and told me that. And in that moment, I had a choice. I could go the guilt route, or I could go the shame route. And I'll tell you right now, my tendency is to go the shame route, to start beating myself up, to be like, "Well, what kind of person are you? Like, what kind of dad does something like that? You're supposed to be a pastor. Like, what if people find out about this?" We're like, "Great job, pastor," right? Like, "You're going to damage this girl. We got to bring somebody else in to be this girl's father. You are horrible. You're not good enough. You'll never be good." And it's just like start beating myself up. And if I'm honest, at times it almost feels noble. It feels like it's a good thing to beat yourself up. But it's not. It's not. Why? Because if shame is attacking my identity, you know what it's going to make me do? And you can see this if you kind of go through the rest of the passage. You see what the people start to do. It'll start to make me blame. Like I might start blaming my wife, or I might start like implementing more strict rules about what happens to you if you come out of your room after bedtime. Or I'm definitely not going to apologize. Like there's all these things I'll do if this attacks my identity because it forces me to go on the defensive. But in that moment, I decided to take the guilt route, where instead of letting it get to my identity, I addressed the action. So I went back upstairs, right? I acknowledged that what I did was not a good thing, right? I sat down with my daughter and I said, "Listen, Mia, I was not kind to you in the way that I spoke to you before. And that was not because of something that you did. That was because I was angry about something else. I'm sorry. Would you forgive me?" And right away, she smiles. She gives me a big hug and she says, "Of course, Daddy." And everything was great. And if you think about it like that, like guilt, when handled the right way, guilt can be a good thing, right? It's an indication that something's gone wrong. It's like a check engine light. And it's good when we acknowledge that there is guilt, that we have fallen short of a standard that we're striving for, and we address it. One pastor told me that there's more potential for growth in failing and owning it than there is in just getting it right the first time. And that was totally true in that situation. My daughter and I got a little bit closer because we had that moment. But there is a huge difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is unmistakably tied to an action, whereas shame is this vague, foggy sense of being a failure. It's an attack on the identity, and we can't miss the difference between the two. There's something in our community, we call it mommy guilt. Really, it's mommy shame. It's this feeling like you are never enough, you're never doing enough, you're never signing your kids up for enough, you don't take them enough places, you don't play with them enough. That's a huge issue here. I don't know, maybe it's a huge issue there. But what I told our people here is that if you're feeling that, one, that's not a healthy thing. God does not want you to feel that way. Two, if you feel that way, if shame has the ability to grab you in that place, it's probably because you care. And you're probably doing way better than you think you are. So don't give shame a place inside the way that you understand yourself as a mom or as a parent or as a business person. Whatever realm of life shame grabs you. In this passage, you can dig into it on your own, but you'll see it causes all sorts of damage. It causes the people to blame one another. It causes them to hide from a God they really should be running to. It causes them to cover up. It's a really, really damaging thing. But the cool thing about this story is the way that God responds to it. Immediately, God wages war on their shame. First, he addresses their coverings, these little plant coverings that they have. He gives them real clothes. And then he makes a promise that shame one day will be handled once and for all. He speaks to the serpent and he says, "I will put enmity between your offspring and hers," talking about Jesus. He says, "He will crush your head and you will strike his heel." He's talking about Jesus on the cross. It's the first hint of the whole gospel. The idea of Jesus dying on the cross for us, for handling our shame. Our shame. God wages war on shame in the human heart. And years later, the Apostle Paul would explain it like this. He says, In his letter to the church in Rome, he says, God demonstrates his love for us. He puts his love on display in that while we were still sinners, that's a statement of identity. He says, while we were still sinners at our worst, that's when Jesus died for us. When we were at our worst, Jesus gave everything for us to show us that we were worth his love. So think about this. If shame says that you are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and acceptance, then Jesus says that yes, you are flawed, but in spite of that, you are deeply loved and completely accepted. In other words, right now, you are invited to live a life with Jesus where you are fully known and fully loved. You are invited into that relational paradise, obviously not in its most complete sense. But that's the way that we were made to live. Because of what Jesus did on the cross for you, you can be fully known and fully loved by him. And it is a beautiful thing. Your value is not based on your performance. And when that starts to sink in, the more we believe that, if we bring that back to mind every single day, and it's something that needs to, for me at least, needs to be brought to mind every single day, that my value is not in what I do and whether or not I measure up. My value is determined by what someone would pay. And Jesus on the cross determined my value, showed me that even though I don't measure up, I'm fully known. I am deeply loved and completely accepted. And so I want you to just think, what could life be like? What could one day be like with no feeling of shame, with no feeling like you weren't worth love or acceptance because you didn't measure up? I believe that God wants to take us there, but it starts by understanding his love for us. Thanks for letting me hang out with you this week. I hope one day we can meet in person, but until that day, stay well.
Well, I really hope that was helpful for integrating faith with life. Listen, if you're in Northwest Indiana, I'd love to have you join us in person. Head over to suncrest.org and plan your visit.